So I'm very glad to present you Professor Robert Richards. He's from the Department of History, Philosophy, and Psychology, professor in these 3 departments at the University of Chicago, as well as from the Committee on Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science. He is also director of the Fishbein Center for the History of Science and Medicine of the University of Chicago. His research is in history and philosophy of psychology and biology, and he has a particular interest in evolutionary theory, biopsychology, ethology, and sociobiology. He has argued for a revaluation of evolutionary ethics. He made a recognized contribution to history of science, exploring the causal, temporal, and moral grammar of historiography. He is author of many books, notably the one in which he describes and analyzes the impact of the German Romantic movement on philosophy and science in the age of Goethe, for which he received the Lang Prize in 2003. Professor Richards actually also received awards for teaching at the University of Chicago in undergrad and graduate school. And in 2011, he received the prestigious George Sarton Medal in recognition of distinguished scholarship and contributions to the advancement of the history of science given by the History of Science Society. And we have to mention, he co-authored a book with Michael Ruse that will be with us next week, entitled Debating Darwin, in which, as Robert used to say, they do not agree about the sources of Darwin's evolutionary thought. So it's really an honor and a privilege to have you with us today, Bob. So please, welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to talk to your class. Maria, Elice, and I go back about 4 or 5 years when she spent her sabbatical time at the University of Chicago, and we came to know each other at that point. So I invited her to come to Chicago, and now she's invited me to talk to you about Chapter 3 and a little bit about Chapter 4 of The Origin of Species. The book itself, as you I'm sure know, is one of the most important and significant books in the history of science. It revolutionized the discipline of biology, and it spread its impact far beyond that. If you compare Darwin's contribution to science to, say, Einstein, that's about the only equivalent you can make. Einstein certainly revolutionized the discipline of physics. Darwin did it extensively in biology, but Einstein didn't have the kind of cultural impact that Darwin has had. Evolutionary ideas have spread through the social sciences and even into physics. We talk about the evolution of stars now. That concept of evolution has permeated the larger culture. It has had an impact on religion. So Darwin's contribution is extraordinary. Amazingly, however, not in your case, but few biologists have actually read Darwin's book. And I guess the attitude is, why should they read it? They already know what's in it, or believe that they do. Because you can find Darwin's message in those 2 paragraphs that always accompany an introductory textbook in biology, where the author is summarizing Darwin's achievement and does it in rather expeditious terms. But you have now been introduced to the text itself, and you see that there's an awful lot in that book that is often glossed over or not understood. Several years ago, I was walking on my campus and I ran into Michael Wade, an eminent evolutionary biologist. And Michael was teaching a course to freshman students on Introduction to Biology. And he thought he would have them read Darwin's Origin of Species, a book that he himself had never read before. And I suspect that's the case for many biologists. And he came up to me and he said, Bob, you know, Darwin really knew a lot of biology. He was surprised at that. And I had to allow, yes, Darwin knew a lot of biology. But even Darwinian scholars seem not to have read the book. You'll have an amusing example of that next Friday. Someone who reads and knows what's in the book and reads more into the book than he reads out of the book. Well, we'll be discussing chapters 3 and a bit of chapter 4 of the Origin today. And I invite you to interrupt me as I explicate the chapters and talk about those chapters. So if you have a question or an objection and you think I've got something terribly wrong or confused in my analysis, raise your hand and Marcello will interrupt me and ask the question or allow you to ask the question. So we'll have a discussion of chapters 3 and a bit of chapter 4. I'm going to start out by asking you a question to ponder. The chapters 3 and 4 are roughly on the same subject, natural selection. Why did Darwin write 2 chapters on natural selections? The struggle for existence is of the essence of natural selection. And in the chapter itself, it begins with a definition of natural selection. But then there is a subsequent chapter, chapter 4, in which he discusses natural selection again from a different perspective. But why 2 chapters? I don't actually know the answer to that question myself, and I'm hoping you're going to help enlighten me. So I'm going to put up my screen in a second. And I take it now you can see my screen. What I'm doing is going to give you just a quick recapitulation of Darwin's trajectory. So as you know, he comes back from the Beagle voyage in 1836, December of 1836. And in March of 1837, he opens the first notebook, which he will call the Transmutation Notebooks, given that that auspicious title, the B notebook, the C notebook, the D notebook, and the E notebook, and also the M and N notebooks. In 1842, he composes a short essay which gives the gist of his theory. He expands that in 1844, 2 years later, to a pencil sketch of about 250 pages. And he has a fair copy made, and he leaves 400 pounds in his will should he die before he has the opportunity to publish this great idea that he's had. 1848, he gets distracted in the description of a species of barnacle. He found a new species that he found on the voyage. And he gets taken up with that, and he winds up describing all the known and extant species of barnacles and all the extinct species of barnacles then known in a large 4-volume work. Lyell takes him aside, Charles Lyell, they had become friends, takes him aside and says, look, we know that you're working on this book or this idea. You better get to it or somebody's going to beat you to it. And so in 1856, he begins to write a long manuscript, which is going to be called Natural Selection. And he gets about halfway through the intended chapters, and he gets the letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, where Wallace says, I have an idea about the origin of species. Let me tell it to you, and if you think there's anything to it, would you communicate to Charles Lyell? And Darwin at that point almost has a heart attack because he says it's as if Wallace were leaning over his shoulder and reading out of his own notebooks. In 1858, there's a presentation before the Linnaean Society of chapters of Darwin's pencil sketch and also of Alfred Russel Wallace's essay. Amazingly, the secretary of the Linnaean Society at that point, in summarizing what occurred in that year of 1858, nothing unusual happened. Well, Darwin begins to abstract that long manuscript, and the abstract is The Origin of Species. Had he continued to write the book, Natural Selection, it would probably have gone to 2 very fat volumes, and it would be unreadable, or at least not as easily readable as The Origin of Species. Accident produced, in this case, a bestseller. So it's published in November of 1859. One of the conspicuous absences from the book is any discussion of human beings. Only in the last chapter does he mention that light will be shed on man from this perspective. Darwin seems to have thought that if he talked about human beings in The Origin of Species, people would get distracted by that and focus entirely on the implications of his theory for human beings. Well, as it turned out, if you looked at the first reviews of the book, that's all they did. They knew what the implications were for human beings, and they focused on that. Darwin thought that he had to say something about human beings in their evolutionary perspective. And in 1868, he begins a work called Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. And he was going to, as an addendum to that book, include a discussion of man, because as he said to Wallace, man is an eminently domestic animal. Well, he never talked about man in that book. And in 1871, he was sort of forced to write The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. It's a hybrid book, as you perhaps know. The first section is on the descent of man. He was forced into it because of his friend Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace, when he came back from Borneo from his collecting trip, came back to England when spiritualism was on the rise. That is, seances were being held. And Wallace became a true believer that we are guided by the spirit world. And he had a problem. He recognized that Darwin tried to explain everything by natural selection, all the traits that human beings exhibit. But why does man have a large brain? It's not necessary for survival. It seems superfluous for survival. As Wallace said, all you need is a brain about the size of that of the average club goer in London to survive. The brain of about the size of an orangutan's. But we have a brain far in excess of that. We have traits. We can do mathematics. We paint. We have artistic impulses. All of that doesn't seem to lend itself to survival. So Wallace argued that we are under the aegis or under the control of higher spiritual powers, and they select us as if we were domestic animals, and they want us to have certain kinds of traits, and we're selected for that purpose. This drove Darwin crazy. He complained to Wallace that he had given up the theory of natural selection. So Darwin sets out to right what he thought was Wallace's wrong in writing The Descent of Man. Well, that's the brief trajectory. Let's now talk about chapter 3. And if you hold on just a second. So if you look at what I think the important elements of chapter 3 happen to be. First, there are 2 chapters devoted to the topic of natural selection. And as I put the question to you, why is that the case? There are certain rhetorical features of his argument that I think are often passed over. Darwin uses metaphors with some dexterity. So there's the metaphor of struggle itself. As he says, he's using struggle in a metaphorical sense, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There is the face of nature. He employs this metaphor a couple of times in the essay, or in the chapter 3. The face of nature bright with gladness. What we don't see beyond that bright, glad face of nature is the death and destruction that goes on below, and what we only notice when we pay attention. The question that arises is, what explanatory weight do metaphors carry? Are they simply rhetorical devices to gain an advantage over the reader? Are they explanatory? And that's a question that we'll have to deal with. Struggle, which is the topic of chapter 3, he points out is a result of a geometrical rate of reproduction. Darwin does some calculations, as we'll see in a moment, about reproductive rates. And as you know, if you've read the chapter carefully, the rates are astounding. So for example, if you begin with 2 elephants, a pair of elephants, and they live roughly 90 years, and during that period they have 3 litters of 2 calves each, then in a period of about 20 years, you're going to have 15 million elephants. That's a huge rate of reproduction. So there must be some way of stopping that kind of excessive reproduction, some checks on reproduction or on the survival of the organism. And I think one of the other important features of the chapter is something apparently you just talked about in the previous class. It is the notion of the ecological structure of the environment. It's not so much the climate that one is struggling with as part of the environment. The environment of an organism is other organisms. And I think Darwin makes that fairly clear by some very important concepts. He also does some experiments and observations to demonstrate that struggle. It is often thought that Darwin did not do experiments. That's not true. As you see in chapter 3, he mentions 2 different kinds of experiments, and he engages in the experimental analysis of the struggle of plants in a garden that he marks out, a 2 by 3 foot garden in which he checks the number of weeds coming up and finds there are roughly 300 sprouts of weeds, of which only a fraction reach reproductive positions. So one rhetorical feature of Darwin's book is he surreptitiously, that is, in a hidden way, mentions natural selection through all the previous chapters. It's not that he waits till chapter 3 or chapter 4 to introduce natural selection. He's already done it in the introduction and in chapter 1, which is the chapter on domestication. Now, let me ask you, how does Darwin actually, he could have stopped with chapter 1 and he would have a very strong argument for descent of species via natural selection. In what way has he done that? What's the difference between methodic selection and unconscious selection? And is unconscious selection the same as natural selection? What does he mean by unconscious selection? Anyone?
It's, I don't know, maybe unconscious selection is the same as natural selection, but in this first one, the man chooses what he wants without knowing that. The nature makes the same all the way.
Okay, so in methodic selection, an individual, a selector, has an idea of what he wants to produce. The kinds of breeders, that is, selectors, domestic selectors that Darwin was familiar with. John Seabright, one of those selectors, said he could produce a pigeon with a different beak. It'd take him a little longer to do that. If you just wanted a number of new feathers, he could produce that in a shorter time. A beak would take longer, but this would be methodic selection. But what then is unconscious selection?
When the man chooses, but he doesn't looking for something specific.
Yes, exactly. The breeder just wants a good animal without worrying about what good means. He just wants a better animal than he has. So he selects what he takes to be the better animal. And that's what nature does. And if you have examples of that in the domestic realm, you've already demonstrated the operations of natural selection. There is a certain respect in which he could have stopped right there. And you will perhaps have seen in other chapters of the book, he refers to nature making unconscious selections. So the relationship between what nature does and what human beings do is brought together such that there's no distinction between the two. If man is selecting just to have a better animal, that's what nature is doing as well, selecting just to have a better organism in relationship to the other organisms in its neighborhood. Would you all agree? You know, it's sometimes thought that human intervention distinguishes artificial selection from natural selection. But I think it doesn't distinguish it at all, not from unconscious selection. That's virtually the same as natural selection. Well, so chapter 1, he's already made the argument, and he's introduced natural selection, not in an overt way, but in a hidden way. And in chapter 3, he defines natural selection. In chapter 4, he introduces natural selection as an intelligent, altruistic being. And I'll talk about that in a moment.
We have someone with a raised hand.
Go ahead.
It's just, I don't understand why, if I don't know what is the best to select, how I select. So I guess I'm kind of stuck in this argument. So I think it's for the reproduction or survival, but I don't know, because I understand natural selection by this reproduction and survival, but unconscious selection, now I'm just, I don't know if you use survival to see if it's the best, how you select, but you don't know what you're selecting.
Great question, great question. I think it's because what he means is the breeder only has a vague idea of what is better. He has a kind of intuitive perception that, say, in a litter of puppies, wild dogs, that will be a better animal, that it looks maybe stronger, looks like it could run a little faster. But the breeder doesn't have a clear idea of what he is selecting. He just has a vague notion of better or a good animal. And of course, that's in a sense what natural selection has. Natural selection selects organisms and, as it were, does a calculation of the various traits that organisms exhibit, and those that on balance are more advantageous in a particular environment, that's the organism that gets selected. So the breeder is doing something similar. The breeder has a vague idea, an intuitive idea, but if you ask him, what makes that animal better than that animal? He wouldn't be able to specify what makes one better than another, but he might say something like, well, you can just see it. This is a better animal. And I think that's what Darwin means. Does that help?
Thank you.
But I think the idea here is that that's what nature does as well. So he defines natural selection in chapter 3. He introduces natural selection again in chapter 4. So it's not as though he saves natural selections for chapter 3 and 4. He's already introduced it. And that's a subtle rhetorical device. He's familiarized the reader with what's with natural selection, even before he begins to talk about it. Now here is where he defines natural selection at the beginning of chapter 3. And it's an intricate kind of description, but it's also slightly confusing. Owing to this struggle for life, any variation, however slight and from whatever cause proceeding, so you can see right there, he's allowing for the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That is, any variation, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding. So if a parent, let's say, of a wild dog has acquired certain traits during its lifetime, maybe it's been trained to point, those kinds of inclinations to point, as a pointing dog might do toward game, those traits will be passed on and can be selected for. So Darwin has already opened up the possibility that acquired traits can be selected for. He goes on, if it be any degree profitable to an individual of any species in its infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to external nature, will tend to the preservation of that individual. So there is one sense in which what is preserved is the individual. And he goes on, and will generally be inherited by its offspring. So the traits that preserve that individual, allowing it to reach reproductive age, will also allow the offspring to acquire those traits through heredity. The offspring also will have a better chance of surviving. For of the many individuals of any species which are periodically born, but a small number can survive, I have called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection in order to mark its relation to man's powers of selection. So the question is, what is preserved? Is it the organism preserved, or is it the traits that are preserved? And I think through selection and the struggle for life, that's not clear. Natural selection, is it the natural selection of the organism and the organism is preserved? Or is it the trait is preserved in the population? So I think there's a bit of ambiguity there, and Darwin plays off that ambiguity. You will have noticed the kinds of struggle that Darwin specifies between individuals of the same species. So what do you mean by struggle? Darwin says he's using it in a metaphorical sense. There are individuals of the same species, two dogs fighting over a bone, for example. They're struggling over the bone. That gives the primary meaning for the idea of struggle. But then he develops the metaphorical usages of struggle. Individuals of different varieties of the same species might struggle. Individuals of different species of the same genus, individuals of different genera. The principle here, I think, is struggle will be keenest among those organisms that are most alike, most morphologically similar. And as you go down the list of taxonomic categories, individuals of different varieties of the same species, they'll struggle against one another. Individuals of different species of the same genus will struggle against one another. Individuals of different genera. And then, surprisingly, in the individual and the inorganic environment, he says a plant at the edge of the desert is struggling with drought. I think Darwin wrote this book in some haste, and he doesn't always make things absolutely clear. What is wrong with saying between individuals and the inorganic environment there is struggle? What's the problem with that? And the example he offers is a plant at the edge of the desert is struggling with drought. or the dryness of the desert. Does that preserve the meaning that he wants to include in the notion of struggle?
It's a bit different when you compare to the other examples, because in this specific situation, you have the organism limited actually by environmental conditions. The organism struggles, but it's not bilateral. It's not when you talk about two organisms fighting for food. It's unilateral actually, because you have only the organism fighting, struggling to survive.
Yes, but does that preserve the meaning that Darwin wants to have for struggle? That is, isn't it more likely that the organism is struggling with other organisms who face the same environment? That is, the organism is struggling with other contemporary organisms that are also subject to the drought, and those that have the traits that best allow them to accommodate themselves to the dryness will have the advantage and be able to reach reproductive age and pass on that trait. Isn't that what he should mean and doesn't put it exactly correctly?
Actually, when you think about natural selection at the first time, when Darwin talked about this struggle, you think always like a competitive way, or, and as he says in the book, the enemy of an animal. But he gets to this point all the time, but then he takes this different one when the animal, when the being is struggling with the ambient that he's living directly. He usually say in an indirect way. When the other type is more adapted to the environment, so he gets, I don't know if I can express myself too well, but I think we always think about two different individuals fighting for life. Never, we don't think about it, only one against the environment.
Exactly. And isn't the struggle, though, for a trait that allows the animal to survive in a particular environment, but it's struggling to be better than the other animals in that environment and to leave more progeny? And I guess the issue is, and it's the kind of issue you find in contemporary biology, is what is the trait that allows individuals to win the struggle? Is it simply survival, or is it reproductive success? And I think we push on the idea of reproductive success is the trait, is the consequence of a trait that an animal has. So reproductive success is going to be the key idea here. Between individuals of struggling with a dry climate, it is going to be those individuals that are adapted to that climate better than others that allow them to reach reproductive age and pass on that trait to their progeny. I think that's what he should have in mind, and he doesn't quite express it in the way we would like it to be expressed to capture the meaning of struggle that he's trying to develop. And I think what we have to keep in mind is when Darwin is writing this, he's finding out what he means by writing it. The same way you do when you write a paper. You have a fuzzy idea about what you're trying to say. And it's only in saying it that you find out what you mean. And you find some expressions don't quite capture what you intuitively mean. And you try another expression, you try another sentence. And I think that's what Darwin is doing throughout the Origin. So there is going to be some slippage, and I think this is one of those instances of slippage. Another metaphor that he has is the face of nature. It appears 3 times in the book, or in the chapter. We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We often see superabundance of food. We do not see or forget the birds which are idly singing around us. Most live on insects or seeds and are thus constantly destroying life. So there is a happy face to nature, but if we look more carefully, we see there's a lot of destruction and death. Another example of the face of nature, which is a kind of extraordinary way of putting it. The face of nature may be compared to a yielding surface with 10,000 sharp wedges packed close together and driven inwards by incessant blows, sometimes one wedge being struck and then another with greater force. What he has in mind is, I don't know if you're familiar with wedges that split logs. So a metal trapezoid in the form of a trapezoid, you split a log by driving the wedge into a log to split the log. And what he suggests is the face of nature may be compared to a yielding surface, and 10,000 wedges packed close together and inwards driven by incessant blows. That's the struggle. Sometimes one wedge being struck and then another with greater force and knocking other wedges out. It's a rather graphic image that he has produced. And finally, battle within battle must ever be recurring with varying success. And yet in the long run, the forces are so nicely balanced that the face of nature remains uniform for long periods of time, though assuredly the merest trifle would often give the victory to one organic being over another. This is the idea that I think he gets from Lyell. There's a balance in nature, a balance between reproduction and death. And that balance is pretty consistent. It's disrupted when you have, let's say, native species being ingressed upon, being overrun by non-native species. In Chicago, zebra mussels have proliferated in Lake Michigan. Zebra mussels were introduced by ships sailing in Lake Michigan, and they had picked up ballast water from South America, the coasts of South America, in which they took on some zebra mussels. And when they reduced the ballast and let the water out in Lake Michigan, the zebra mussels proliferated, they took over, they threatened the native species. And that upset the balance. But there was, in Lake Michigan, a fine balance between the different species of fish and other organisms in the lake, upset by the introduction of zebra mussels. And here is, Darwin does these calculations. If you go to Cambridge and look at his papers, you see him working out these calculations. A plant, just to show the great fecundity and the notion of exponential numbers. Plants produce 2 seeds that survive each year. A plant produces 2 seeds that survive each year. Those seeds produce 2 more. After 20 years, you'll have more than 1 million seeds. That's an extraordinary rate of reproduction. And I think Darwin introduces these figures because they're so astounding. The rate of reproduction of organisms exponentially is not really obvious to us because it never reaches these proportions. Or elephants, 3 litters of 2 every 90 years. After 500 years, more than 15 million elephants would arise from that one pair. So exponential rates of reproduction, unless they're checked, would just overwhelm the planet. So there must, and since they haven't overwhelmed the planet, there must be checks on organisms. And that's the check of struggle. Here's what Darwin does as an experimental observation. He takes a plot of ground, 3 by 2, and he counts the number of weeds that sprout spontaneously. And he lets them grow, and he finds that 295 don't make it. So the checks against the reproduction of weeds in this plot of ground is extraordinary. And he does another one, 20 species of plant on a 3 by 4 plot of ground. 9 species perished he just lets them grow, and he sees at the end of a period how many are left and what species have survived. They won the struggle. Are these real experiments? What do you think? Are they good experiments? Are they astounding experiments?
Not the best experiments ever, but kind of good in the limits that Darwin had in his time.
Yeah, the kinds of experiments you can do in biology, once you have molecular biology, you can do a lot of experiments. But the kind of development of biology at the period Darwin's talking about, I think these are really remarkable experiments because they demonstrate what he wants to demonstrate, that there's both a reproductive exponential development of organisms, and then they must be checked, and he determines that they're checked in the case of these plants by the experimental observation he undertakes. You spent some time talking about the web of life. How is it that more cats in an area produce more clover? Explain that. Darwin observed this in his backyard at his house in Down, that the more cats in his neighborhood, the greater the sprouting of red clover. How does he explain that?
It's quite a complex sequence of events, but if I can recall it, the cats hunt the rats destroy the nests of humblebees.
Humblebees,
and humblebees are essential for the pollination of the clover. Is that right?
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's a rather graphic and interesting image to indicate the ways in which life is connected with other life. The more cats, the fewer mice you have in an area. That follows. The mice eat the humblebee nests and destroy the humblebee nests. The humblebees pollinate the clover. And so if you've removed the mice from the equation, there will be a proliferation of humblebees and therefore more clover. That's just one of the several examples he gives of this kind of web of life. There's another one that is not discussed really in the Origem, but it occurs at about the same time. It's one of those remarkable predictions that Darwin makes. So this occurs in his orchid book later on, but he has a correspondence with Joseph Hooker, who is a botanist, one of his teachers. And he says, Bateman has just sent me a lot of orchids with Angrecum sesquipedale. Do you know its marvelous nectary? 11.5 inches long with nectar only at the extremity. So here is the orchid that he's talking about. This green-yellow stem-like organ is the nectary, at the bottom of which is a sweet liquid that insects try to recover. And in so doing, they dust themselves with pollen, and when they go from one orchid to another, they pollinate the orchids. But it's 11.5 inches long, Darwin says, and it can only be available to a moth that has a proboscis of that size. So he's not discovered the moth, but he's predicting that since this orchid grows in Madagascar, that you're going to find some gigantic moth. And as a matter of fact, in 1903, the moth was discovered, the hawk's moth, which has a proboscis from 12 to 14 inches long. So a wonderful example of the interrelationship of organisms one to another and the co-adaptation of organisms. So Darwin is quite well aware of this kind of co-adaptation. So you have a chapter on struggle, and he tries to explicate the struggle. But though we see nature with a face bright with gladness, we don't see the struggle and the death that goes on beneath the bright, glad face. He ends the chapter with a kind of remarkable observation. Did anything strike you about that ending of the chapter?
Let's see. Someone talked about this in the previous meeting today.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember the name. Who was it?
Gabriel.
Yes, I think it was me, but there was also someone else who talked about it. And well, for me, it seems so different from the way he's been writing ever since. So it's a change of perspective, a kind of moralist appendix to the struggle. I don't know. It seems kind of weird to me, this final sentence.
Yes, I think Darwin wants to convince you that the world is a good world after all. It's a world that has some death and injury in it, but when we think about the bigger picture, it is a good world. When we reflect on this struggle, we may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply. I think that's Darwin's effort to assuage his own conscience about what he has just described, namely the struggle among organisms. But I think you're right. It has this moral perspective that Darwin thinks of nature in moral terms. And I think the indication that he thinks of it in moral terms, and here's something, if we skip to the next chapter just briefly, we can see that moral character being played out. If you read the essay of 1844, I think, or at least parts of it, you will have come across a passage in that essay in which Darwin is trying to explain to himself the character of natural selection. So the essay of 1842 and 1844 are Darwin coming to terms with his theory, trying to develop the ideas of the theory and their implications. And this passage has its complement in the essay of 1842. But here's what he says. In trying to explain, remember, to himself, and these are only for himself initially. Let us now suppose a being with penetration sufficient to perceive differences in the outer and innermost organization, quite imperceptible to man, and with forethought extending over future centuries to watch with an unerring care and select for any object the offspring of an organism produced under the foregoing circumstances. I can see no conceivable reason why he could not form a new race, or several were he to separate the stock of the original organism and work on several islands, adapted to new ends. Here's key. As we assume his discrimination and his forethought and his steadiness of object to be incomparably greater than those qualities in man, so we may suppose the beauty and complications of the adaptations of the new race and their differences from the original stock to be greater than in the domestic races produced by man's agency. So I think here he is comparing this being, this not an infinitely omnipotent being, but a very being with great powers that can make these kinds of selections. And this is the model, I think, for natural selection. And you can see this being making its appearance in chapter 4. So this is from chapter 4, in which Darwin, at the very beginning of the chapter, introduces what he's going to take the meaning of natural selection. And I think without too much difficulty, you can see that these passages at the beginning of chapter 4 are modeled on a being, a great being with penetration sufficient to perceive differences in the outer and innermost organization, quite imperceptible to man. He says, man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature cares nothing for appearances, except insofar as they may be useful to any being. She can act on every internal organ, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life. Man selects only for his own good, nature for that of the being which she tends. There are two phrases in here that are important. Nature acts on every internal organ, on the whole machinery of life. This is only one of 7 times in the Origem that Darwin uses the word machinery, machine, mechanism, any of its comparable derivatives in the book. But he uses the word end or words comparable to an end, a teleological organism, a teleological end, a goal, many, many times. And nature is acting for the being which she tends. Nature is acting only for that being which she tends, unlike man, who is selfish and selects traits that he himself wants to see in organisms, not what the organism needs, but what he himself wants to see in organisms. And nature acts for the good of the being which she tends. And here's a continuation of that passage. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world. Every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. So nature works for the improvement of each organic being. And this is not an accidental phrase. It appears many times in the Origem. Nature works for the being which she tends. Nature selections can only act only through and for the good of each being. Natural selection, it should never be forgotten, can act on each part of each being solely through and for its advantage. Page 194, so natural selection works for the good of each being. 201, natural selection acts solely by and for the good of each organism. And he concludes with, and this is in the penultimate paragraph of the book, and as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection. If you're a contemporary biologist, what do you find, how would you react to Darwin's assertions that nature acts for the good of each being?
Bob?
Yeah.
I would agree with him as a biologist, because he's showing the very basic property of organisms, which they are self-determinating. And I think you mentioned the word of selection already in the first chapter, then second, then third, fourth, in different ways. And I made the same question last week, like why he begins with domestication. Yeah, and I think it's not so problematic, these teleological aspects, like nature tending for the being or nature working for the being which she tends. Because when we look at cells, and this is one of the points I thought interesting from the School of Santiago, from Humberto Maturana and Varela, in which they show that the word selection can be dangerous. Because when he used these metaphors, the kinds of rhetoric resource, okay, man is selecting something. So it's something outside of the organism. There is an idea of improvement that does not belong to a plant, to an animal, whatever.
Right.
But when he applies this metaphor to nature, it seems like he's attributing something external, that an external nature working in nature. Yeah, so
a kind of intelligence working in nature, nature having a kind of intelligence.
Still, but it's an idea of is the idea of the concept of the object. Yeah, the idea of an object. In the case, the intelligence, the design, or the I don't know.
No, I think you're right.
So it's kind of selection is a kind of contradiction. If you were a serious biologist, you cannot deny the self-determination of an organism. And I think in this way, this word selection is not so appropriate. I understand the argument of Darwin. I'm not criticizing him. Yeah, like his thought.
You can criticize Darwin. It's okay.
No, I cannot, because I realized during my university training, although we have to think in terms of like experimental, Popperian sense that science, there is no definite truth, but every time there was no teacher that was always celebrating and claiming about Darwin, and always it's like incredible. And I see a lot of ideological aspects, but also a lot of interesting aspects in his work. So I don't read like that. And of course, if we read 10 times a book, it doesn't matter if it's Darwin, if it's your book, Bob, you always see different things, but it's not because it's Darwin, But anyway, I think my point here is about selection. I think this is one of the main things that distracts me in reading him.
Well, I think you're on the same page as Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace wrote Darwin to say that he disagreed with the notion of selection because it seems to be an anthropomorphic attribution. The nature is making selections. And he suggests what you really mean is what Herbert Spencer meant by survival of the fittest. And he thinks, Wallace writes Darwin to say, I think you ought to use the term survival of the fittest. And in the 5th edition of the book, Darwin, when he comes to this chapter 4, he titles it Natural Selection or the Survival of the Fittest. But he doesn't get rid of natural selection. He wants to keep it. So I agree with you. Contemporary biologists would have a problem with the notion of selection. But it's endemic to Darwin. It's essential to Darwin's analysis. And I think what we have to say is Darwin was not a 21st century biologist. He was a 19th century biologist. And he used the repertoire of terms and concepts that were available to a 19th century thinker. So while Wallace advises him to get rid of the concept of natural selection, he says, no, it captures what I mean by the operations of nature. He does add Herbert Spencer's term, survival of the fittest, but he doesn't get rid of natural selection. But I think that's one problem. It's not actually the problem that I had in mind, but it is indeed a problem, and it's one that you recognized, and it's one that Alfred Russel Wallace recognized. But does natural selection, let's forget about the problems with selection, does it work for the good of each being? Or does it eliminate most beings? Or does it check most beings?
I tend to believe that it's not for the good of each creature, because it would not select at all. So maybe for some creatures, or for the good of the population of the species. So in that part, I guess I would not agree, because maybe it's kind of a naive perception that the natural selection would be only for the good of the creatures. Because if they're selecting something, some creatures would be destroyed. So I don't see how that could be good for the creatures.
No, exactly. Natural selection works also to eliminate creatures. And in fact, you may be persuaded by the face of nature bright with gladness, but if you look more carefully, you see all the death and destruction that's going on as a result of struggle. So I think you're right. Natural selection, from our perspective, does not work for the good of each creature. It eliminates most creatures. But it's, I guess, my view that Darwin is convinced of the moral character of nature. And nature takes on those features that the recently departed deity exemplified, the traits of God. He endows nature with those traits, and one of them is to act for the good of each being. So he has, I think, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps semi-consciously, attributed to nature those traits that were used to be attributed to God. So nature works for the good of each being, but we know that natural selection, even as Darwin describes it, doesn't really work for the good of each being. It eliminates most beings. So I think this is an indication of the character of Darwin's analysis. It's not exactly the character of our analysis. But I think if you look at the notion of natural selection as being modeled on this being, this superior being with penetration to perceive differences in outer and innermost organization, things that are imperceptible to man, and we assume his discrimination and his forethought, these are attributes that we don't really assign to nature, at least in the 21st century. But Darwin did, because I think he has identified nature with God. And nature, God has moral ends, and nature has moral ends. But I think the message of this is not a mechanical model for natural selection. It is a model of supreme intelligence acting in a moral way. You're going to hear from Michael Roos next Friday that he's going to tell you that natural selection is a mechanistic feature of nature. It has no moral consequences. It is the machinery of life. But I think that's not true. And if you look at the real evidence of the book and the essays that preceded the book, I think you can see that Darwin has in mind for natural selection not a mechanistic model, but a model of moral intelligence. I think
Bob,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, you mentioned I was on the same page of Wallace, but I don't agree that what I'm trying to say, I'm not taking a spiritualistic point of view.
No.
What
but
I'm
you are agreeing that it's anthropomorphic, I take it.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I know you saw that, but my point, even if you say if it's a God is an intelligence, it's still external to nature. It's like
no, I understand your point. I think he is conceiving nature as if it were divine, as if it had intelligence and had a moral perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I see that. And that's why I see also problematic.
Yeah.
Because it's still external. So he's not showing the internal, the intrinsic aspect of his proposition. He's always taking metaphors from outside. He does a lot of observations, and he always has to take metaphors from outside of what he observes in order to show through his observations what he took out of it. It's a kind of weird. And in the end, he brings it back from where he took out. That is, okay, now we will see how all these sheds light to the evolution of man. And then you can have many consequences like social Darwinism and so on. But it's interesting that he starts from human activity, he goes to nature, and then he goes back to human activity.
No, I think that's a good point. You're right. I think you're right. But I think it is wrong for people to read back into Darwin something that's not there, to assume that this is a mechanistic operation, because it just, the very words of his Origin of Species, the book, simply don't support that. So I think you're right. He's expressing a notion of natural selection, which I think most contemporary biologists would reject. So I think you're completely right about that. But I think that's one of the keys in the understanding of Darwin, that Darwin is not a 21st century biologist, even though if you read people like Michael Roos, and you can tell him I said this, it looks as though he is a mechanist through and through. But the very words that Darwin uses belie that. They don't support that kind of interpretation, I think. So I think you're right in criticizing Darwin. It's not the view that we would have today, but it is a 19th century view. And if we're trying to understand the book Origin of Species, we have to admit this.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Robert, excuse me. Were Darwin's own words ever used against him? For example, when he describes nature as a being that is selecting for the good of each species, and is there any scientist or philosopher who used his own words against him to prove that there was some transcendental truth?
Well, Wallace did. Wallace said this is an anthropomorphic attribution to nature. That is, you're pretending nature is making selections in the way that man makes selections with good intentions. So Wallace complained. One or two other individuals complained that Darwin was utilizing an idea that was really foreign to nature itself. Not too many people complained about it because it fit well with the conceptions of 19th century biologists, which are still creationist conceptions. And Darwin, too, is liable to that charge. He is, if you ask what role does God play in the Origin of Species, he does play a role. When you get to the very end of the book and look at the last chapter, what Darwin objects to is the notion that God interferes in nature and creates organisms and species individually. But what he doesn't object to is that God created the laws that govern nature, that God promulgates those laws. So the laws have a teleological character. But this is something that he asserts, and it's compatible with a lot of 19th century concepts that he both used and would be familiar to his readers. So not too many readers complained about the language of the Origin. Wallace did, and a few others did, but not many.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Robert.
It's actually Richard's, yes.
I think João Gabriel has a question. He have a raising hand.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. Yes, at first I would like to thank you for this lecture, which I'm really enjoying. But there's something you mentioned twice, and I think I have to make this question about it.
Okay.
We were just discussing in the previous lecture about this period in the 19th century, which Darwin was inserted, when he lived, in which there was a romanticizing vision of nature, and that was quite visible in the thinkers of the time, and Darwin included. So when you said at the beginning of the lecture about why exactly is there this this chapter about the struggle of for existence before the fourth chapter, which introduces the proper concept of natural selection, And
Right.
I would like to ask you, do you think that maybe it's because of how problematic, how complicated it would be for people of the time to see the struggle, to actually agree with him that there is a struggle happening while we watch the birds singing and the beautiful flowers in the fields and things like that?
I think that's a very perceptive idea that you have. I think you're right. Darwin wants to explain the notion of struggle. And if he if he offered the model that he has for natural selection of an intelligent being, the idea of struggle would disappear. But I think that's part of his analysis, that there is a struggle going on. And that's the struggle is, in a sense, what's doing the selecting. But he shifts gears in the 4th chapter. And I think it's because Darwin has this, again, this overriding moral perspective of nature. He thinks nature acts morally and for the good of each being. But that's hard to square with or make consistent with the notion of struggle. But he thinks struggle is the idea that allows natural selection to operate. So he's got a kind of contradiction, and I think you put your finger on it. On the one hand, if he just wrote chapter 4 and didn't have anything like a chapter devoted to struggle for existence, you would presume that this is a kind of creationist analysis. But the real forces involved are those of struggle and reproductive multiplication. So as a result of this kind of hyperbolic reproduction, struggle must ensue, and he's trying to make this as causal as he possibly can, to understand it in terms of what a good scientist, even in the 19th century, would maintain, namely a causal analysis. But he then drifts off into this moral perspective. So I think you're right. He has to maintain the notion of struggle, and he has to highlight that notion. And if he just wrote the 4th chapter and not the 3rd chapter, that would be obliterated. It would be not observed. So I think you're right about that. Good idea.
Thank you.
Professor.
Yeah.
I was thinking here about this thing of an intelligence without a conscience. And I don't know, but there is another force that seems like that, besides God and natural selection. I was thinking about the invisible hand of Adam Smith. It seemed to me that there is the same moral characteristic in the capitalism understanding of the invisible hand. Can we make this kind of parallelism reasoning? Can we make these metaphors to talk?
I think you can, and I think you're right. Darwin read Adam Smith. He was aware of Adam Smith's ideas, and the notion of an invisible hand is roughly, I mean, in Adam Smith, it's the invisible hand of capitalism, which has a force, but it also has a kind of moral character to it. So I think Darwin is suggesting something similar. I think you're right. Very good.
Thanks.
So I take it you're all convinced about natural selection having these moral and intelligent features. And so you'll be ready for Michael Roos when he tries to tell you it's all mechanistic.
I think we have some of them here that are more on your side.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. But I think if you look at the actual words of the book, it doesn't support the notion of a mechanistic analysis of natural selection. And I think it's the character of Darwin himself. Darwin was a good guy, and I think it pained him to interpret nature in anything but benevolent terms. You know, when he was on the Beagle voyage, he took along with him John Milton's Paradise Lost. And even when he was going in country on mules, he packed in his saddlebags a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, and he read it a lot. And there are passages in the Origem which have a kind of rhetorical feature to them, almost poetic. And I think he derived that from Milton. But in Milton's case, if you ask, what is the message of Paradise Lost? It's this, that out of death comes life more abundantly. That out of the death of Christ comes everlasting life. And I think that simple message of Milton's poem captured Darwin's notion, captured Darwin's mind. And he has infused nature with those features that, as I say, were attributable to the recently departed deity. Darwin has a role for God, both an explicit role as a promulgator of laws, as a lawgiver, and as a moral guide. And I think those are the features that he has attributed to nature.
We have someone with raising hands. Not anymore? Oh.
There is Gabriel, Flávio, and Isabella.
Can I go first?
Please, go ahead.
I have a simple question. Professor Brown, I don't know if you know her, Janet Brown, she did a lecture to us, and in the first chapter of her book about the Darwin biography, she says that he read William Paley books, and he tried to deny his ideas. But right now you said that Darwin did this watchmaker argument. My question is, was he able to deny completely William Paley's ideas, or we can see some of his ideas renewed here at the Origem?
Well, I think you're right. Darwin, when at Cambridge, he had to read Paley's Natural Theology, among other books. And he liked the logic of Paley's argument. So you're right about that. I think he was slightly amused because Paley was directing a good deal of his argument against Erasmus Darwin, his grandfather. So I think that, Darwin in a later chapter talks about traits of great perfection. Can natural selection explain, say, the origin of the vertebrate eye, that is the visual apparatus? It seems so exquisite and so refined. Can it explain that? And Darwin tries to explain it, and I think he does a very good job of explaining it. But as he said, and this is a result of his reading Paley, he said, whenever I think of the eye, my blood runs cold, because Paley used the vertebrate eye as an example of an organ that seems so refined that no kind of naturalistic explanation can account for it. It must be the direct result of the operations of the Creator. So I think Darwin wants to deny that God intervenes in nature and produces directly organisms. What he doesn't deny is God acts to create the laws by which nature operates. It's a very deistic kind of position that he undertakes. But you're right, Paley is an influence on Darwin as well as Milton. Any other questions?
Gabriel?
I've already made my question. Thank you.
Well, I hope that you will offer Michael Roos a warm reception. Actually, Michael and I, as you may have guessed, are good friends, but we have entirely different views about Darwin's accomplishment.
Professor Richards, there's another question in the chat, a question of Flavio Ferreira. He doesn't have a microphone available, so I will read the question on behalf of them.
Okay.
And he wrote, "Hi, good morning, Professor Richards. Darwin cites Malthus' essay on human population to compare them to populations in nature. However, Malthus' theories turned out to be wrong and were eventually discarded. Nowadays, do biologists still use Malthus' essay to explain Darwin's theories?" And he thanks.
So I guess the issue is, what did Darwin draw from Malthus? And I think what Darwin drew from Malthus is just the notion of the exponential growth in population as being the kind of event in nature that causes a struggle. Now, Malthus doesn't talk about a struggle except by indirectly, but Malthus wrote his book against the notion of the perfectibility of man. The French Revolution declared that human beings are perfectible. They can be made much better. Malthus suggests they cannot be made much better because there's this kind of balance that occurs. Whenever times are good and plentiful, human beings start a reproductive avalanche. They start reproducing huge numbers. And with the kind of reproduction that human beings are capable of, the environment can't sustain them. The food supply can't sustain that. So there'll be a crash of the population, and this kind of oscillation will continue to occur. But I think what Darwin saw in Malthus was the notion of reproductive exponential progress, or he turned Malthus into a progressive thinker. So it depends on, you say that Malthus is no longer acceptable by contemporary economic theory. I agree, but he didn't accept Malthus to core. He accepted Malthus's ideas of reproductive pressure, and under reproductive pressure, struggle must ensue. So I think that's the essential features of Malthus's analysis that he borrows. And I think you can't deny that feature. In fact, Darwin demonstrates it by just his calculations of the reproductive capacities of a pair of elephants or a plant producing 2 seeds. And each of those seeds produce a plant that produces 2 more seeds. And that will grow exponentially into huge numbers of seeds after 20 years, over a million seeds. So Darwin came to appreciate the exponential reproductive character of human beings and other organisms. And since we don't see the world completely disappearing under the weight of elephants, there must be a check against their reproductive procedures. And he finds that check in a variety of fashions: disease, accident, predation by other animals. So what he takes from Malthus is this notion of reproductive capacity and shows that there must be some check against it, as Malthus showed there was a check against human reproductive capacity. So he doesn't accept Malthus the whole shoot and match, the whole feature of all of Malthus. He takes out of Malthus just this one idea, reproductive excess. Well, I thank you for your attention. I'm sure you will welcome Michael with great generosity.
Sure we are. There are many people with raising hands. Do you have more few minutes, Bob?
Yeah, sure. Of course.
Sure. So please.
Can I go? Okay, Professor Richards, first off, I would like to thank you for your very inspiring lecture. It was a great privilege to have you here sharing ideas with us. But I'm going to take the discussion to other point. My question is related to your book, Debating Darwin, especially to the issue that emerged in a meeting in our research group about history of biology. So we were discussing the book Unifying Biology, written by Betty Smokovitz. By the way, it's a very good book. We didn't finish reading yet. Yes. It turned out that we started the discussion about other debate involving Richard Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould. To put in a nutshell, for me, the debate about some social and psychological aspects are determined by genetics or natural selection. Idea that Gould disagree and consider biological determinism. So when I was reading the preface of your book, Debating Darwin, for today that Maria Elice offered to us before the lecture today, this debate about evolutionary psychology and social biology was mentioned about Darwinian ideas. So I got curious about your opinion involving this debate regarding your experience in the area. So I would like to hear your position, if you take sides about this debate between Dawkins and Stephen Gould.
Dawkins and who?
Gould, Stephen Gould, Stephen Jay Gould.
Stephen Jay Gould, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think Dawkins is not a careful thinker. He is an ideologue who is happy to enter a debate with a hammer as opposed to a refine. I think it's unquestionable that our biology has an impact on our psychology. There's an intimate relationship expressed in our psychology by the biological foundations that we have. But specifying what that kind of determinism is and how extensive the determinism is, it seems to me that you need a refined analysis. When I read Dawkins' attempts to declare religion nothing but superstition, I agree with his conclusion, but I disagree with his analysis. He rides roughshod over religious perspectives that have a great deal of intellectual integrity. And I would reject his simple belief that all religion is superstition. It's not a very refined analysis.
Okay. May I ask you to finish your presentation so we can see each other?
Sure. Now I will, just a second. Now I'm going to need some help because I pressed the stop sharing button and it looks like I'm still sharing.
Not for us. We are seeing you.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you seeing people here now?
I'm not seeing people. No.
No.
I think you can use the shortcut, the Alt Tab shortcut, to return to the window.
Alt
Google window. Alt Tab.
I don't get the last
Tab.
Oh, Alt Tab.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Hold on. Okay. Now I see you.
Okay. And if you want to change how many people you see, you have to go to the 3 dots and change layout. So you have different options to see everybody or just few of us.
Okay, we see each other.
Yeah, okay. So the next one, who is?
I have another question. Well, thank you, Professor Robert, for the lecture. It's been amazing to talk and to discuss the ideas with you. You've mentioned Paradise Lost, which is one of my favorite poems. And I was very amazed by this relation you suggested by between Darwin's thinking and Paradise Lost poetry. So could you give me an example of how exactly Darwin uses Newton's thought in the book, Origin of Species?
Well, there's an image at the end of the book called when Darwin invokes the entangled bank. So let me see if I can quickly find it. Well, I don't know that I can. So he says, consider an entangled bank with insects flitting in and out in a bank of plants. And if you look at Milton's Paradise Lost, there's a passage in Milton where Satan is outside of Eden and he is stopped by an entangled bank. But Milton says he flies up to the tree of life and contemplates not life, but death. I think that notion of an entangled bank is one that comes straight out of Milton. And as I said, it's not only the entangled bank metaphor, but it is the notion that somehow out of death and destruction comes life. And that's essentially the message of chapter 3, that out of this kind of competitive structure resulting in, because of reproductive capacity, the struggle produces beings of greater perfection. And as he says, that nature produces such beings. So I think it's the language too, is the cadences. When you say it may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being. That the cadences of those passages struck me as being Miltonic. They have that kind of feature to them. And Darwin honed these passages. He rewrote these passages several times to get just the kind of power, pace, and refined analysis that he was seeking.
Thank you. It's really, really, really amazing. Thank you.
Marcelo, você tem a ordem aí para chamar o próximo?
I think Gabriel was the last one, so we're okay.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you very much for your questions, which I thought all of them were very good. And it looks like you have a lively group of students. So Maria Elice, we will meet each other presumably in person again at some point.
We hope so. I hope so.
So thank you all for your questions and your attention.
Thank you, Professor Richards. It was a very good morning for us, and we will continue discussing your ideas and Michael Rue's ideas next week.
Give Michael my best.
Yeah, and just this is a great lesson for all of us, not only for the students, but for the professors that are here. That is, we can have different opinions about the same subject and still being a civilized person, and even friends. And,
even friends.
Even friends. That is more difficult. Right. Yeah.
Okay. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye.